The sun shimmered across Lake Meriton, turning the rippling water into a mirror of gold as my moving truck rumbled up the old gravel road that led to my new home, or rather, my great-grandfather's home. The Meriton Lake house had stood on the eastern bank for over a century, long before anyone had ever dreamed of building a homeowners association around it. When I inherited it from my late grandfather, I knew I was moving into a piece of history, and apparently into the middle of a battlefield I didn't even know existed. As I hopped out of the truck, stretching my legs after a 6-hour drive, I didn't notice the cluster of people standing at the cul-de-sac across the road, watching me like a hawk. They wore pastel polos, carried clipboards, and whispered among themselves with that tight-lipped intensity that could only belong to HOA board members on high alert. The house itself was a masterpiece of old craftsmanship, wide oak beams, stone chimneys, and wraparound porches shaded by ancient willows. My great-grandfather, Samuel Meriton, had built it in 1908 when the land was little more than forest and farmland. He'd later sold off parts of the property to developers who built the modern subdivision that surrounded it. But the lake house had remained in our family, untouched by time, an island of history surrounded by perfectly mowed lawns and beige conformity. The first few hours went smoothly enough. I was unloading boxes, humming to myself, when I noticed a golf cart roll up and stop at the edge of my driveway. A woman in her mid-50s stepped out, wearing oversized sunglasses and a badge that read HOA President Linda Hawthorne. Her tone was clipped, her smile painfully forced. "Excuse me," she called out, hands on her hips. "Can I help you?" I wiped the sweat from my brow and smiled. "No, ma'am, but thank you. Just moving into my house." She frowned, glancing at her clipboard. "There must be some mistake. This property isn't part of our approved housing area. No one is authorized to move in here without clearance from the HOA." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Clearance? This is private property. Been in my family since before your subdivision existed." That seemed to set her off. She clicked her tongue, pulled out her phone, and muttered something about illegal occupancy and trespassing on association land. Within minutes, 2 more board members arrived, all equally self-important and suspicious. They peppered me with questions: who sold me the house, whether I'd filed permits, whether I was aware of the bylaws governing lakeside structures. When I tried to explain my family's ownership, they waved me off like I was a confused tourist. Linda pointed to the lakefront. "That dock violates HOA safety codes," she declared, "and that exterior paint color isn't within approved palette standards." I blinked. This dock has been here since before any of you were born. My great-grandfather built it. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's very nice, but this community maintains standards. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to escalate this." I shrugged and went back to unloading my boxes, assuming they'd get bored and leave. Instead, 20 minutes later, I heard sirens. 2 police cruisers pulled up behind my moving truck, lights flashing. My stomach dropped as one of the officers approached, hand resting on his holster. "Sir," he said calmly, "we got a report of someone trespassing and breaking into a property." Before I could speak, Linda stepped forward, arms folded. "Yes, officer. This man refuses to identify himself. He's attempting to occupy private property within the Meriton Lakes HOA without permission." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I reached into my bag, pulled out the deed, and handed it to the officer. "My name's Ethan Meriton," I said evenly. "This is my great-grandfather's home. Here's the original deed from 1908 and the updated record of transfer from the county office." The officer glanced between the papers and the furious woman beside him. "Ma'am," he said, "this property isn't listed under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, according to county lines, it predates the subdivision entirely." Linda's face turned bright red. "That's impossible. This entire area is under our covenant." The officer gave a small smirk. "Not this house, it seems." She sputtered and tried to argue, but I could see her confidence cracking. The officers eventually apologized for the misunderstanding and left, leaving Linda and her board members fuming in the driveway. As they stormed off, I overheard her muttering something about getting to the bottom of this. That night, I stood on the porch and watched the moonlight glint off the lake. For a moment, peace returned, the kind only old wood and water could give. I thought about my great-grandfather Samuel and how proud he'd be that the house was still standing strong. But I had no idea that this confrontation was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to find a thick envelope taped to my front door. It was an HOA violation notice citing me for half a dozen infractions ranging from unauthorized occupancy to non-compliant mailbox design. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. It was absurd. They were trying to control a property they didn't even own. But as the days passed, the situation escalated. They began sending inspectors photographing my house, even blocking my driveway with cones labeled private HOA access. They thought they could bully me into submission like every other resident. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just another homeowner. I was a Meriton, and my family's name wasn't just on the deed to this house. It was carved into the foundation of their entire community. As I began digging through old boxes my grandfather had left in the attic, I discovered a leather-bound journal filled with brittle pages and old photos. Among them was one image that made my heart stop, a black and white photograph of my great-grandfather standing beside a stone building with a sign that read Meriton Community Hall, established 1911. I froze, realizing what I was looking at. That hall, still standing today in the center of the HOA's main square, was their headquarters. The place where they held meetings, passed rules, and enforced their so-called authority. My great-grandfather had built it. And according to the notes in his journal, the land under it had never been legally transferred to anyone else. Suddenly, everything clicked. The HOA wasn't just overstepping, they were standing on my family's land, and they didn't even know it yet. The following morning, I sat at my grandfather's old desk with the journal spread open, tracing the faded ink with my fingertips. The entries dated back over a century, describing the early days of Meriton Lake and the construction of the community hall. Built for the good of the town, my great-grandfather had written in his looping handwriting, to serve as a gathering place for neighbors for meetings and for celebrations. What caught my attention, though, was a small note in the margin: deed held privately, Meriton Family Trust retains land rights in perpetuity. I stared at those words, the meaning sinking in. The HOA's beloved hall, the very heart of their authority, stood on land that still legally belonged to my family. They were tenants, not rulers. I decided to confirm my suspicion. I drove into the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Inside, a kind clerk named Mrs. Palmer helped me dig through the archives. After an hour of flipping through records, she looked up with a surprised expression. "Well, Mr. Meriton, you're correct. The Meriton Community Hall was constructed in 1911 on a parcel of land never sold or transferred. According to this document," she said, tapping a yellowed map, "the HOA owns the structure, but not the ground beneath it. That land remains part of the original Meriton estate." I couldn't help but grin. "So, technically," I asked, "they're squatting on my land?" Mrs. Palmer chuckled. "If you wanted to be dramatic, yes. But legally speaking, you still have authority over it. You could charge rent or even revoke access, though that might cause quite the stir." A stir, I thought, was exactly what I wanted. I made certified copies of every document and returned home, planning my next move. By the time I got back, however, the HOA had already struck again. There were 3 more violation letters waiting for me, one about improper lawn maintenance, another about unsightly debris, my moving boxes, and a third warning me of potential fines for failure to comply with community standards. I almost laughed at the absurdity. They were relentless, but their power ended at my property line, or so they thought. That afternoon, I walked down to their precious community hall. It was an impressive old building made of the same gray stone my great-grandfather had favored. The brass plaque out front read Meriton Homeowners Association, established 1973. The irony hit me like a hammer. They'd named their organization after my family and built their empire on land we still owned. I stood there for a while, studying the foundation stones, each one hand-carved and familiar. I found my great-grandfather's initials etched faintly in the corner, SM 1911. As I turned to leave, a voice called out sharply, "You can't be here without authorization." Linda Hawthorne came striding down the front steps, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She looked even more agitated than before. "Mr. Meriton," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "you've already caused quite enough disruption. We've received numerous complaints from residents about your conduct and the appearance of your property. We expect full compliance with our bylaws by the end of the week." I met her glare with a calm smile. "Funny thing, Linda, I was just here to admire the hole my great-grandfather built." She frowned. "Excuse me?" I took out the photocopies of the old records and held them up. "Samuel Meriton. You've probably seen his name on the cornerstone. He constructed this place in 1911, and according to county records, the land it sits on still belongs to the Meriton Family Trust, meaning you're standing on my property." The look on her face was priceless, a mix of disbelief, confusion, and anger. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "We've used this land for decades." "Doesn't change the ownership," I said lightly. "I'm not here to make trouble, but you might want to check your paperwork before you call 911 again." She sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I said, turning toward my truck. "You'll find out soon enough." Back home, I decided to make it official. I drafted a formal notice of land ownership and mailed it to every member of the HOA board, complete with certified copies of the county deeds. The letter stated clearly that the Meriton family retained legal rights to the land beneath the community hall, and that any continued use of the property without authorization could be considered trespassing. I didn't threaten them outright. I just reminded them of the facts. Within a day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People stopped by my driveway, pretending to walk their dogs just to sneak a look at me. I overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you hear? The new guy owns the land under the hall. And Linda's furious, says she's calling an emergency meeting." The balance of power was shifting, and I could feel it. The same people who had treated me like an outsider were now nervous, unsure whether their little kingdom could survive without the ground it stood on. 2 days later, I received an official invitation, well, more like a summons, to attend the HOA board meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. They were meeting in my great-grandfather's hall to talk about how to deal with me. I decided to attend. When I walked into the hall that evening, every board member was already seated at a long wooden table beneath a chandelier that had seen better days. Linda sat at the head, her expression tight as a drum. "Mr. Meriton," she said coolly, "thank you for joining us. We're here to resolve a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" I echoed, taking a seat. That's a generous word for what happened. A few members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a nervous-looking man named Doug, cleared his throat. "Look, nobody meant to offend you. It's just that our records didn't show." "Because your records don't go back far enough," I interrupted gently. "You built your HOA 50 years ago. My family built this community over 100 years ago." Linda leaned forward. "We'd like to propose a solution. The HOA will officially acknowledge your ownership of the land beneath the hall, and in exchange, you'll grant us a perpetual use agreement so we can continue operations uninterrupted." I tilted my head. "Interesting offer. What do I get in return?" She hesitated, clearly not expecting me to call her out. "We could waive your property assessments." I laughed softly. "Linda, I don't have assessments. You've been trying to impose your rules on private property." The room went silent. I could feel their uncertainty filling the space. Finally, I stood and looked around at the stone walls, the beams, the history my family had laid down. My great-grandfather built this hall for the people of Meriton. He believed in community, not control. But somewhere along the way, that spirit got lost. So here's my offer. I'll let you keep using this hall rent-free as long as you stop harassing homeowners who don't bow to your bylaws. Linda's jaw tightened. "You can't dictate terms to us." "Actually," I said with a calm smile, "I can. You're meeting on my land." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Voices rose, papers shuffled, and people argued. I simply turned and walked out, leaving them to grapple with the truth. Outside, the evening breeze rippled across the lake, and I felt a deep satisfaction settle over me. The tide had turned, but I knew Linda Hawthorne wouldn't give up easily. And I was right. By the next morning, she'd already launched her counterattack. By the time the next morning rolled around, the HOA's fury had reached a boiling point. I could feel it in the air, the silence of neighbors avoiding eye contact, the way golf carts lingered at the edge of my driveway like vultures circling a carcass. It didn't take long for the next move to arrive. Around 10 a.m., a courier pulled up and handed me a thick, glossy envelope sealed with the HOA's emblem. I tore it open and found an official letter titled Notice of Legal Review Regarding Property Ownership Dispute. Inside, in perfect bureaucratic fashion, Linda had drafted a statement claiming that recent discoveries regarding the Meriton Community Hall property boundaries are under formal review, and that the HOA reserves the right to contest any and all ownership claims inconsistent with current administrative maps. In other words, they were challenging me. I couldn't help but chuckle as I flipped through the pages. Their so-called legal review was a scare tactic, a bluff meant to intimidate. They didn't realize they were up against a family that had dealt with real land disputes back when boundaries were drawn with iron stakes and bloodlines mattered more than bylaws. I wasn't going to be bullied. Still, I knew better than to underestimate Linda. The woman had an almost fanatical devotion to her position. She didn't just want control, she wanted obedience. So, I decided to turn the game back on her. The first thing I did was call my attorney, an old friend of my father's named Peter Lawson. Peter specialized in historical property law, the kind of man who knew how to trace ownership through dusty archives and faded signatures. When I explained the situation, he laughed so hard I could hear him slap his desk. "Let me get this straight," he said between chuckles. "The HOA that called the cops on you is sitting on land your great-grandfather still owns?" "Exactly," I replied. "And now they're threatening to review it." "Oh, this'll be fun," Peter said. "I'll pull the full title history and get the legal description certified. If they push this to court, we'll bury them in their own bylaws." That night, as the lake shimmered beneath a rising moon, I felt both anger and amusement. The HOA thought they were fighting some careless newcomer. They didn't realize the roots of this land ran deeper than their entire existence. Still, I wanted to give them one last chance to back down peacefully. So, I printed a large copy of the original deed, framed it, and the next morning I walked down to the community hall. It was early, the air smelled of dew and freshly cut grass, but I knew they'd be there. Sure enough, through the tall windows, I saw Linda and her board huddled around the long table, muttering in low tones. When I entered, all eyes turned to me. Linda's lips tightened. "You're not supposed to be here during a private board session." "Oh, but I am," I said, setting the framed document on the table. "Just wanted to make sure you had the right paperwork for your legal review." She squinted at it. "What is this?" "The original deed from 1911, I said, "signed by Samuel Meriton, notarized by the county clerk, and verified again in 1974 and 2009. It states that the land this building stands on, including the surrounding 30 feet, belongs to the Meriton family estate. Permanently. You're free to look it up, but I already did." Her expression flickered, the confidence in her eyes replaced briefly by doubt. "Even if that were true," she said stiffly, "we have adverse possession rights. We've maintained this property for decades." Peter had warned me she might say that. I smiled. "Not quite. Adverse possession only applies when the original owner has abandoned the land. My family never did. We've paid taxes on it every year since 1911. In fact, your HOA has been using our property tax lot for access to the lake. Technically, you owe us back rent." The color drained from her face. "You're bluffing again." "Try me," I said calmly. "I already sent copies to the county assessor and the local paper. You'll be seeing this story soon." The room erupted. One board member muttered, "Wait, he's serious?" Another groaned. Oh, no, if this gets out. Linda tried to silence them, but her voice wavered. She slammed her clipboard down and pointed at me. You're making a mockery of this community. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. No, Linda, you did that when you called the police on the man whose ancestors built your entire neighborhood. I'm just setting the record straight. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving the deed on their table like a bomb waiting to go off. Over the next few days, word spread fast. It started with whispers, then local gossip, and before long, it hit the town paper. The headline read, HOA dispute erupts over land ownership. Turns out founder's family still holds title. My phone rang nonstop with neighbors calling, curious or apologetic. Some found it hilarious. Others were furious, not at me, but at Linda for dragging them into what was now a public embarrassment. The HOA's pristine reputation had cracked like thin ice. Of course, Linda didn't take the humiliation lightly. She launched a full-scale counterattack, filing a formal challenge with the county and trying to freeze my ability to modify or access certain shared roads. But that only made things worse for her. Peter immediately filed a response backed by every historical record, survey, and tax receipt we could find. The County Review Board took one look at the evidence and dismissed her claim. They even noted in their summary that the HOA's administrative boundary map conflicts with verified county plat records and is therefore unenforceable against the Meriton estate. When I read that line, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Linda had managed to do the impossible. She'd proven her own authority was meaningless. By that weekend, the HOA's board was in chaos. Half the members resigned. Others began calling for new elections. Some residents even petitioned to dissolve the HOA altogether, tired of paying fees for a group that couldn't even manage its own land. Through it all, I stayed quiet, letting them fight amongst themselves. I spent my days repairing the lake house, repainting the dock, and planting flowers along the old porch. The air around me finally felt peaceful again. But Linda, as expected, wasn't done. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard a car pull up. She stepped out, no clipboard this time, just a weary expression. Ethan, she said softly, can we talk? I gestured to the porch. Sure. She sat, staring out at the water for a long moment before speaking. You embarrassed us. Humiliated me, honestly. But I didn't know. None of us did. We thought we were protecting the community. I get it, I said, but protecting a community doesn't mean controlling it. My great-grandfather built this place to bring people together, not to fine them for painting their doors the wrong shade of blue. She sighed, nodding. Maybe you're right. I just wanted order. But it got out of hand. I looked at her, seeing the exhaustion behind her polished exterior. You can still fix it, you know. Step down. Let the neighborhood run itself for a while. You might be surprised. They'll probably thank you for it. Linda didn't respond right away. She just stood, nodded faintly, and said, maybe it's time. Then she walked away into the twilight, her figure fading against the lake's reflection. That night, I stood on the porch and looked toward the old community hall. The lights inside were off for the first time in weeks. For the first time, the lake felt quiet, not tense, not angry, just still. I smiled, knowing the Meriton name had once again restored peace to the land it built. But I also knew one final piece of the story was still unfinished, one that would seal the Meriton legacy forever and make sure no one ever tried to challenge it again. The morning after my conversation with Linda, the lake was unusually still. The surface reflected the sky like polished glass, the kind of calm that only comes after a storm. The entire neighborhood felt different too, quieter, less hostile. For the first time since I moved in, no golf carts patrolled the street, no letters were taped to my door, and no one peeked from behind their curtains. The HOA had finally gone silent. But I knew silence wasn't the same as peace, it was the sound of something ending. And I intended to make sure it ended properly, with my family's legacy protected once and for all. I spent the next few days finalizing paperwork with Peter, my attorney. We drew up a legal notice that would make everything official and irreversible. The Meriton family was reclaiming full ownership of the land under the community hall and its adjoining property strip. We didn't plan to evict anyone or destroy the building. No, that wasn't my style. Instead, I wanted to preserve the hall, but under a new name and new purpose. I would turn it into something that honored what my great-grandfather originally built it for: community, not control. When Peter handed me the finalized documents, stamped and certified, he grinned like a man who'd just closed the deal of a lifetime. You realize, he said, you now technically own the heart of the HOA. Without that land, they can't hold meetings, charge dues, or legally enforce anything. You've effectively pulled the plug. I nodded slowly. That's the plan. The next day, I sent out invitations, not HOA notices, but real invitations written on thick parchment paper to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The heading read, Meriton Community Gathering, an evening of restoration and remembrance. I scheduled it for Saturday evening at the hall. And though I didn't say it outright, everyone knew it would be the final meeting of the Meriton Lakes HOA. By the time the evening arrived, the hall was filled to capacity. People who had once glared at me now approached hesitantly, offering polite smiles and quiet greetings. Even those who had once sided with Linda seemed curious. At the front of the room, the plaque that once read Meriton Homeowners Association Hall had been temporarily covered with a cloth. I stood beside it as the murmurs died down. Good evening. I began, my voice carrying through the old stone hall that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. I know many of you don't know me well, but you've probably heard enough rumors by now to fill a book. So, tonight I want to tell you the truth about this place, about my family, and about what comes next. I paused, scanning the crowd. Even Linda was there, sitting near the front, her expression unreadable. This hall, I continued, was built in 1911 by my great-grandfather, Samuel Meriton. He didn't build it for power or authority. He built it so people could gather, to celebrate, to mourn, to share ideas, to build a community. But somewhere along the way, that spirit was lost. Rules replaced kindness. Fines replaced cooperation. And this place, meant to unite people, became a symbol of control. A few people nodded quietly. Others looked down, ashamed. I don't say that to blame anyone, I said, softening my tone. I understand how it happened. People wanted structure. They wanted order. But this land wasn't meant to be governed by fear or bylaws. It was meant to be shared, respected, and remembered. Then I gestured to the covered plaque. As of this morning, the Meriton family has officially reclaimed the land beneath this building. It's no longer HOA property, it's part of the Meriton Historical Trust. But that doesn't mean we're closing it. In fact, I pulled the cloth away, revealing a new bronze plaque underneath. It read, Meriton Lake Heritage Hall, founded 1911, reborn 2025. A place for all, bound by history, not rules. A murmur spread through the room, followed by scattered applause. Linda's eyes glistened, not with anger this time, but something else. Maybe relief. I continued, starting today, this hall will be open to everyone in the community, not as an office for authority, but as a gathering space. You'll be able to host events, meetings, weddings, or just come here to sit and remember how this place began. There will be no dues, no penalties, no fines. The HOA, as it was, is officially dissolved. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a man in the back, Doug, the nervous board member who had once tried to defend Linda, stood and began clapping. Slowly, others joined in, until the room erupted in applause. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. For the first time, the sound that filled the hall wasn't bureaucratic chatter, it was genuine joy. After the meeting, neighbors came up to thank me. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jensen, squeezed my hand. Your great-grandfather would be proud, she said softly. This is how it should have always been. When the crowd had dispersed and the hall was quiet again, Linda approached. She looked tired but peaceful. You really did it, she said. You ended the HOA. I didn't end anything, I replied. I just put it back the way it was meant to be. She gave a faint smile. I used to think control was the same as care. I wanted everything perfect, the lawns, the mailboxes, the colors. But I see now that perfection isn't what makes a place beautiful. It's people like you, people who remember why it exists in the first place. I nodded. You can still help, Linda. This hall needs volunteers, caretakers, storytellers. If you want to be part of that, you're welcome. Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since I'd met her, she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. I'd like that. When she left, I stayed behind, sitting alone in the old hall. The stone walls seemed to breathe again, as if relieved of the tension that had gripped them for decades. In the corner, I noticed something glinting in the lamplight, the initials SM carved into the foundation. I traced them with my fingers, imagining my great-grandfather doing the same over a century ago. Outside, the lake shimmered under a sky full of stars. The sound of crickets carried across the water, mingling with the soft rustle of the willows. It felt like the land itself was at peace. The next morning, I took one final step to secure the Merritton legacy. I filed a declaration establishing the Merritton Lake Historical District, protecting the lake house, the hall, and surrounding land from any future corporate or HOA claims. It was now registered as a community heritage site, ensuring that no one could ever again turn it into a playground for power-hungry neighbors. A month later, the transformation was complete. The old community hall had been repainted, the floors restored, and a display wall erected inside, filled with photos and artifacts from the original Merritton family archives. Families gathered there every weekend, children playing outside, parents chatting over coffee, seniors reminiscing about the early days. The place that once divided the community now brought it together again. On the day of the reopening ceremony, I stood by the lake with Peter and watched as children ran down the dock my great-grandfather had built. "You pulled off something rare, Ethan," Peter said, smiling. "You didn't just win a fight. You restored legacy." I nodded, watching the sunset turn the water into molten gold. It was never about winning. It was about reminding everyone, including myself, that some things can't be owned or ruled. They can only be honored. As the laughter of families echoed across the lake, I looked back toward the hall, now glowing warmly in the twilight. The sign above its door caught the fading sunlight, the letters shining proudly, Merritton Lake Heritage Hall. For the first time since I'd moved in, I truly felt at home. And somewhere, deep in my heart, I could almost hear my great-grandfather's voice carried on the breeze, proud, steady, and smiling. "Welcome home, Ethan. You did us proud."